All right. Well, this is so exciting. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Mathoni Wambu Kral. I am not Karen Finney, who was the originally intended moderator. My dear friend is going to be on CNN, and I am her stand in. I will do my best. Again, my name is Mathoni Wambu Kral. I am the co founder and executive director of the Women's Democracy Lab. We are a national C3 organization designed to help elected Indigenous and women of color and femmes who, in particular, are serving at the state and local level and really trying to explore more of the ways that we can help to eliminate some of the barriers and challenges that so many of you all face, which is why it is such an honor, frankly, for me to be a part of this historic moment where never before have the four caucuses, the Quad Caucuses that represent communities of color across this country, had women at the helm. And as someone who has spent most of my career working with staffing, advising, training, recruiting more women and women of color to run for office, it is incredibly exciting to be a part of helping to moderate this awesome conversation today. So, with that, I am going to go ahead and get us started. There was a recent Gallup poll finding that has shown that 57% of Americans believe that the country would be better run if more women held political office, with younger adults ages 18 to 34 and non white adults the most likely to believe this. While women's representation in government is nowhere near the near matching the roughly 50% share of the US adult population, the number of women in most levels of government has reached record highs. Currently, women comprise between a quarter and a third of elected leaders across all levels of government in the United States. Today, we have four of those elected leaders who are making history during this Women's History Month that is quickly coming to a close. And for the first time in US history, all four leaders, as I've shared before, of the Quad Caucus of state legislators are these incredible women that you are going to hear from today. And for those of you who are not familiar, the mission of the Quad Caucus of state legislators is to promote equitable outcomes in all communities, focusing on people of color in the areas of health, education, family, economic security, and juvenile justice. The Quad Caucus seeks to strengthen cross racial relationships, increase the percentage of policymaking leaders that support an equity agenda and racial healing, and to build a national voice. Let's get to know our fierce and fearless leaders. I am going to call them in to the conversation, starting with NBSL President and Alabama State Representative Laura Hall. Good afternoon.
Good
I
afternoon.
am going to call in Minnesota State Senator Mary Kunish, Chair of NCNASL. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
I am calling in Maryland State Representative and Minority Leader Criselda Valderrama, Chair of NAPACSL. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Tony. I just want to make a slight correction. I'm actually deputy majority leader. So we're the majority in Maryland.
And we
Just want to make note of
yes,
that.
thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
that. And last but absolutely not least, calling in Utah State Representative Angela Romero, President of NHCSL. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. And I'm actually the minority leader of the Utah House of Representatives.
Thank you so much for these corrections. I apologize to all of you. I live to see you all continuing moving up in leadership. So these titles are very important because they represent some very important roles. So thank you.
Well,
So
if we're all talking about our roles again, I'm also the first Native woman to hold the assistant majority leader position in the Minnesota Senate. So I think we just learned a little bit more about each one of us.
Absolutely. And Representative Hall, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all again for the additional information. So let's take a little time now then to dive a little deeper. Um, uh, we're going to dive a little deeper, I'm sorry, in a few minutes into sort of each of the areas. But first, wanted to start out with some broader questions to allow the folks who are joining us here to get to know a little bit more about each of you. And I think this is an opportune moment since I've got a garbage truck in my background to go ahead and be able to open it up to questions. So, starting with Representative Romero, who inspired you? How did you get to your role?
And I have construction going on here. They're tearing down the Capitol. So if you hear that noise, it's just them doing construction. Actually, my grandmother. So my grandmother went to 8th grade, and she was one of 12 kids growing up. And she raised me. My grandparents raised me, and she was just a strong woman. And she always told me that I had to stand up to people. I had to fight for people's rights. And so she is my role model and someone I always look to. People always want us to have like a leader, and there are many leaders in my community, like Dolores Huerta, and many other women who have led. But if it wasn't for my grandmother and her spirit, I wouldn't be here right now.
And how, maybe just briefly, how did you get to the role that you are in? And thank you for sharing that.
I was mentored at a young age. What's nice about this Quad Caucus meeting and seeing the four of us here, there's two of us that are in really red states, and there's two of us that are in blue states. And so for me, it was always, growing up in a super red state, but having community and that community support. So when I'm a first generation college student, and I met a gentleman by the name of Archie Archuleta and Pete Suazo, and they got me involved in the Utah Coalition of La Raza. I was one of the first students to serve on that. And through that, I worked on political campaigns, and I actually worked on Pete's political campaign. And he got into the House of Representatives, and he was the first Chicano to serve in the Utah State Senate, and he mentored me. So I was privileged enough to have these men and women in my community, but specifically these two men mentor me and grew me to run for office. It wasn't something that I was thinking about. It was something that came to me through my community.
That's really powerful. And I would just say, I think that the politics in your state are literally changing by the day. There is just so much organizing going on. Where states may sit in one place, and I'm sure Minnesota can attest to this in one in one season, in another, with the right kind of organizing and the right leaders and the right results for people. There is a possibility for a lot of the politics to change, and so I'm going to turn to you, Senator Kunish, and ask you the same question. Who inspired you and how did you get to your role?
Well, I first of all, I'm just really thrilled to be here with all of you this morning. So I would say that most of my influence was through my mother and my four strong, very opinionated Hunk Papa Lakota women. The Kelly girls were an indomitable force, just individually and especially when they were together. But my dad was also a very strong influence in our lives as he instilled social justice values in us, even as a, back in the day, Republican or conservative. Social justice was very much the kind of work that he did. I also came from a very large family of 13, and every single one of my brothers and sisters have influenced the work that I do at the legislature. We're very different. We live different places around the country, practice different faiths, all kinds of things. But I think growing up, we heard the stories about my great auntie, Josephine Gates Kelly. She was the first chairwoman of the Standing Rock Nation. And I grew up hearing incredible stories about her leadership and advocacy for her people. And so just thinking about her a lot kind of gets me through some of the tough work that I do here. I was a teacher for 25 years. So my students, the teachers that I worked with, those communities that I worked with through the school districts, they really motivate a lot of the work that I do as the legislature and as the chair of education finance in Minnesota. It's those 25 years of community that drive a lot of the work that I do.
It's incredible. And shout out to the teachers who are serving in our elected bodies. I've done a lot of work intentionally trying to recruit more educators, more nurses, more social workers, more people who are working right where a lot of the brokenness and a lot of our challenges, our most complex challenges, exist. And so thank you for that. Turning to Representative Hall, who inspired you and how did you get to the role that you are in?
Thank you. I was probably inspired most with my grandparents lived next door to us. And so my grandmother, especially each day that we came home from school, she was always interested in knowing what we had learned. And we had to give her some description of what we had learned and how we were going to use it. And my parents always told us that they wanted us to get a better education than the one that they had because they were either my mother was sixth grade, my father had gone to eighth grade. He later finished, got his GED while I was growing up. But education was just a basic foundation that was stressed throughout my family as a way to move up in any area. The once Beyond my family, my grandparents, and my parents, I'd say the person that probably had the most influence on me being where I am today is my third grade teacher, Mrs. Lila Winston Gant. I really thought she was standing at the door each day waiting for me as a student coming to her class and always welcoming me and making me feel like that I was the prettiest and the smartest little girl that she had ever seen. Little did I know she was doing that for every student. But she was an inspiration to me. So each time I have an opportunity to share why I am where I am today, I lift up Mrs. Lila Winston Gant and how she made me feel that I was capable of doing anything uh, because she thought I was pretty and smart. Now, how did I get here, to get into this role? I am an educator. I have been teaching in the same community for 25 years. The position came open. I have been actively involved in other elections, and a number of my friends reached out to me and suggested that I should run for this office. So I tell people I was voluntold to run for this office, in addition to the fact that I had been living in the same community where I taught made a big difference as well, because then students would advocate, their parents would advocate for me. So that is why I ended up serving in the Alabama legislature.
Thank you so much. That's incredible. It made me sit up straighter when you talked about the words that she shared with you. There's something that it just puts into you when people pour that kind of positivity and visibility into young people. Delegate Valderrama, can I ask you to share a little bit more about you as well. The same question, and then I know we'll go from there and into digging into the specific topics and policy work that you all are doing. But I just think that this background and knowing sort of your origin story is so important for people to hear because we are celebrating the historic nature of you all's leadership, and this is a big part of it. Who inspired you, and how did you get to this role?
Thank you, Mathoni. I just want to say a big shout out to all my fellow chairs. I think this really rocks the House and Senate. Having said that, I'll just say we're all pretty smart women, Representative Hall, and you being our senior member, I give very much props to you.
Thank
Having
you.
said that, what many people may not know about me is that it actually, I wouldn't say it runs in the blood. I would definitely not say that. But my father was in politics prior to my succeeding him. And I would like to preface by saying that I have had a lot of, I'm trying to think of the proper word. I could say slang, very much so. But when I first got elected here, It was all, oh, she's just here because her daddy was here. But let me just say, uh, he raised both my sister and I. I'm the eldest of two, and he got us involved in politics at a young age. He was part of our Democratic Central Committee in the county. I reside in Prince George's County in the state of Maryland. I'm a lifelong resident of the county, so I know my legislative district. And my father started there, became a judge, and went to the House. Having said that, I always find it very interesting when people hear if a family member, whether it's a child, a spouse, a relative, what have you, follows in that political uh, particular footsteps, which is the political scene, that it's somewhat frowned upon and looked upon as if it was just handed over. I can tell you, as a woman of color, I earned my place here. In my first primary election, I barely won. I won by less than 100 votes. And so for anyone, who thinks that just because you have a family member or such, it was instilled in us at a very young age. My sister and I worked on campaigns, just as the minority leader mentioned in her bio. Uh, I also come from a labor background, a healthcare background. I'm a former healthcare worker, as a former respiratory therapist. I worked for the union. I believe in the union's mission. Um, all of those issues that have played a role in my life, and still learning, because you never stop learning, especially in the assembly, has made me the legislator that I am and still striving to be. No one's ever perfect. I know I'm not, but we try to do our part, especially as women of color in our particular caucuses and in our particular legislatures, to represent not only our our community of color, but our constituency, and that we all truly are united. I mean, we can only be united if we work together. And so, how I got to this role, I would give credence to everyone in my life, those mentors, my godparents who were very politically involved. But obviously, I'll give more to my father, who instilled in us that we need to be represented, the Black, the Brown, the Native American, the Hispanic. And my county, Prince George's County, we have, I actually wrote it. Now I can't find where I wrote it. But in the state of Maryland, we're 6.1 million. And in my county alone, as a Filipina American, our Asian population in my county is only 4%. So when I say that I earned my way, it wasn't easy, although people think it is because of my predecessor. But I'll claim that, and I'm very proud as the second Filipino, but first Filipina American woman in the Maryland State Legislature.
Okay, we're going to celebrate that and also recognize the flip side of growing up in politics and how much you are sharing your beloveds with an entire community. My aunt, State Senator Alice Palmer, who was recently deceased out of Illinois, I know that all those days that she was spending in Springfield were times where her daughter, who has absolutely followed spiritually in her footsteps, not necessarily directly in politics, but I mean, it was her service that inspired a lot of us to stay in this and to be very engaged. But it is a lot to give up as well. And it's beautiful that you still chose a life of public service. So thank you. I think now we're going to turn to really delving into the specific policy conversations that each of you have come to share your different work and perspectives on. We are going to begin with the topic of maternal health and turn to Representative Laura Hall to really dig into talking about how, for compared with white women, minority women are disproportionately impacted by social and economic inequities that lead to a decline in their maternal health. There is no single answer, there's no silver bullet. We know that to addressing the increasing maternal mortality rate. Legislation must be introduced to reverse the trend and provide systemic support to women and their families. And even though I'm turning to Representative Hall on this topic, I am absolutely continuing to encourage that we um, invite our other leaders to jump in when you have something that you want to add. According to the World Health Organization, maternal health refers to the health of women during pregnancy, childbirth, and the postnatal period. And when we talk about maternal mortality, it refers to the death of a woman while pregnant or within 42 days of the end of pregnancy. Despite decades of progress throughout the world where mortality rates are declining, they are climbing higher in the US. And it must be noted that maternal mortality rates are higher for minority women compared to white women, especially among Black, Native American, and Alaska Native and Asian Pacific Islander women, some of whom have 2 to 3 times higher rates of pregnancy related death compared to white women. Representative Hall, why is this happening and what is causing the racial disparities?
Well, first, let me say, even though I represent the Black Caucus, maternal health issues affect women of all races. And it's a result of the type of quality of health care that these diseases may go undetected too late. Research has shown that implicit, I'm sorry, implicit biases may have an impact on how an OBGYN approaches a conversation with females, especially Black women, in terms of their treatment or how they discuss their treatments with them and kind of push it off as maybe that it's just a pain that or something that they imagine, or even if you're talking about the management of fibroids. And so the incident, I was thinking of an incident that occurred with a friend of mine who had been going to the doctor for months about the pain that she was having. And it took two or three other doctors before she was determined. It was determined that fibroids were her issues. There are factors, other factors in addition to implicit bias, such as social determinants of health that affects a wide range of health and how we function and the quality of outcomes and the risks that are caused, economic stability, access to quality health, quality education, um, where a person lives, whether they're living in an environment that is safe or whether they do not feel that environment is safe, also creates a stress within on that particular individual. So all of these, I say all of these or mention all of these, but there is no single answer, no silver bullet. Uh, the real thing is about the systemic problems, and we know that racism and other issues also play a major role in how women are treated and how doctors that treat them are not always sensitive to the issues and concerns that they bring to the table.
Absolutely. Um, is it surprising to you that these factors align?
No, it does not. And I will speak personally. I had a niece that had a child about a year before, a year ago, and she indicated to me that after the child was born, she had not gone back to the doctor because she was a Medicaid patient, but never gone back to the doctor for any type of treatment or services. And for me, that was a link that we as state legislators should play a major role in terms of at least making sure that if an individual mother has had a child, they should have access to the medical services for more than 2 months. And so all of these determinants, the factors of not having money, the factors of where you live, are having a great impact on women and those that are having children, especially. In addition to the other issue as it relates to what a woman should or should not do with her body as it relates to abortion or abortion pills, etc.
Oh, we're going there. Right. So, how are you and your fellow Quad Caucus leaders able to address these inequities? What is it that you uniquely about, I mean, this moment where we have such incredible women of color who get it, helping to lead these very important bodies? How are you all working to change the system?
Well, I think I'm honored to be a part of this leadership, and I believe that increasing the awareness, determined to work together on issues that impact women. That you have a group of women, these four women here that you've heard even from their introduction. There's no shyness about them in terms of getting the work done, and I think collectively, when you put that energy together along with the information that is needed, making a difference and improving the quality of life is certainly the goal and objective of each one of us.
Yeah, and can I open that up to some of the other members to see if they want to add anything there? If anyone else wants to jump in around how your leadership and how you are looking to help change this part of the system around maternal health.
I'll just give a little 2 cents here. I unfortunately don't sit on the committee that handles those issues, but as a woman of color and again a representative of a district, what I may not have mentioned is that my county, Prince George's County, is described as the most affluent African American county because African Americans are the majority of our county, which I'm proud of. We're all of color, right? And so I will say that the current chair of our Health and Government Operations Committee, who is also a Prince Georgian and came in with me, Delegate Jocelyn Peña Melnick, who is Dominican, she chairs and has brought this issue forth where all the women of, not just women of color, but especially women of color on this issue, because we represent a county that is unfortunately deprived, for lack of a better word, with these resources. So we all know that our respective caucuses have our citizenry, whether documented or otherwise, which in my opinion really should not matter, deserves the proper maternal health that every woman deserves. And so I guess that wasn't really much of an answer of what I am doing personally, but by my vote and by my support and by the caucus's support, the Asian caucus,
It's okay, baby.
we know that this issue is very huge at hand, especially for those legislative districts or districts that we represent in general that have a large impoverished colored community.
Thank you. And Representative Hall, just as we kind of wrap up this conversation, very quick question that I'm going to combine two questions actually. And it is about the challenges faced in trying to advocate for these issues. Can you name what some of the biggest challenges are, and how do we keep this from being just seen as a women's issue? We know that maternal health absolutely impacts women, but it also impacts men, children, the economy, and communities in general.
Sure. So there, one of the things that NBCSL has done is we wanted to make sure that our members have access to the CDC's Maternal Mortality Review Committee. And this committee is formed by, or in my state, it comes to public health. It deals with representatives from public health, obstetrics, gynecological, maternal, fetal medicine, nursing, midwifery, and advocacy groups. And so making sure and gathering that data and having access to that data to educate our members and our constituents on the needs and what these reports show. Why is it important for a woman to be able to see a primary care physician? Why is it important for them to realize it, be sensitive to risk factors that a new parent may not be aware of, and how important it is in order to make sure that that mother, when she goes home with her child, that that family has the support of making sure that they have the resources for making sure the child is being fed. And so funding and implementations, how much money do we need to set aside? Who is going to carry out the different programs that exist? So I think collectively as an organization, as for women, that we can certainly make sure in each one of our states we are addressing these issues and concerns. NBCSL also had a resolution that was introduced by Senator London Lamar of Tennessee that dealt with the issues that I just mentioned. And so making sure that our legislators, our membership are informed on the issues, the impact that it has on our communities certainly is a step in the right direction in addressing the concerns that are being raised today.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you all for naming some of the other incredible legislators from around the country who are contributing to this work. I am going to pivot us now, and I'm hoping that folks can hear me. I have an impacted voice, so I apologize. But I'm going to pivot now to Senator Kunish to talk about a tough topic as well. These are all hard. And this one is moving us in the direction of talking about violence against women. The rates of violence against women are grossly underrepresented, but the data does exist. It is alarming, especially in light of the violence that occurred during the pandemic. Violence against women is not new, but how it's defined continues to evolve, which is critical to supporting victims and holding folks accountable for their actions. Women of color continue to be disproportionately targeted by violence compared with white women, but there is no quick fix to an issue plagued with complexities. Federal legislation in the Violence Against Women Act and state legislation will only be successful in helping women who are victims of violence if there's also a focus on proactively preventing violence in the first place. So, Senator, um, this is a longer question just because I want to also try to help shape some of the data. Violence against women, such as domestic and intimate partner violence, has historically been vastly underreported. However, what we know is that the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that in 2021, 34% of female murder slash non-negligent manslaughter victims were killed by an intimate partner. The most recent data from the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey is from 2015 and found that approximately 4 out of 10 non Hispanic Black women, American Indian or Alaskan Native women, and 1 in 12 multiracial non Hispanic women have been a victim of physical violence, rape, and/or stalking by a partner in their lifetime. This rate is 30 to 50% higher than what is experienced by white non-Hispanic, Hispanic, and Asian women. Alarmingly, those numbers go up when we look at Indian nations. According to the Indian Law Resource Center, more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence, and more than 1 in 2 have experienced sexual violence. Senator, why are women of color disproportionately targeted victims of violence?
That's a really complex question, and we know that historically, as women of color have been victims of poverty, lack of education, lack of economic support, and there's so many to identify that one single factor for these high rates of violence because they are a vulnerable population. It can't be just attributed to one single factor. In 2020, there was a report from the New York City on the intersection of domestic violence, race, ethnic, and sex. And that found that there were increased rates of domestic violence in high poverty neighborhoods where a lot of the folks had low median household incomes and had high rates of unemployment. So unfortunately, this is a really common thing among our communities of color all across America, including on our reservations. So here in Minnesota in 2019, I created the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force. And we studied we looked at the pandemic of Indigenous women and why they are murdered at that 10 times more than the national average on some of the reservations and in the urban core. But until recently, but nobody was really collecting that information. We had a really hard time finding the real data because nobody was collecting it or it wasn't being collected with fidelity. And it's really important to know that many of our Indian nations are unable to prosecute non-Indians who reportedly commit the vast majority. I think about 96% of sexual violence against Native women is done by non-Native folks. And we know that our Alaska Native women continue to suffer at those highest rates of forced sexual assault and have reported rates of domestic violence up to 10 times higher than the rest of the United States. So while I'm here representing Native Americans, I'm also here as a woman who represents really all women, because I believe that women warriors are necessary, like the women that we're seeing here today, to achieve that justice for all women who are victims of violence. And here in Minnesota, with the success of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force and the creation of a permanent office of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, former Representative Ruth Richardson and I also were able to create a missing and murdered African American women's task force to study that same historic trauma and create a permanent office for them as well in our state government.
That's incredible. Do you think that the reporting is low? Because I mean, you named something very clear on reservations because of the legal structure that does not allow for the largest number of perpetrators to actually be brought to justice. In the rest of the US, do you think that the reporting is low because violence against women lives in the shadows here?
I would 100% agree with that. Oftentimes when women would go to the police or look for support, they were dismissed. They were, poo-pooed. There was very little, initial work done to investigate or create. And remember, for a long time, it was perfectly legal for a man or a husband to, um, you know, uh, violate their wife. They could, they were not prosecuted for rape if they raped their wife. They could beat their wives and there would be no serious effects. So this has been a historic practice for so long. And we are finally, especially I think because we have more leadership of women, able to address these issues.
Absolutely. I think this is also why it was so important that Representative Hall brought up the fights that we're also having on women's health care and the reproductive freedom front, because they are all so connected. The fact that it is, now illegal to get a divorce in the state of Missouri if you're pregnant it's just unthinkable, frankly. And what kinds of conditions does that create if we're going in the direction of these draconian laws? So, speaking about the laws, what is it then that, in particular, that the Violence Against Women Act, because unlike some of the other priorities of the Quad Caucus, has federal support and ongoing action at the federal level. What does the most recent reauthorization do that previous iterations of the act didn't?
Sure. So the violence against women are often known as VOW. Um, that it shows that there are more than 660 new state laws that have been enacted to combat that domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, especially and stalking. That was just added to the VOW law. So it also included making stalking a crime, and it upgraded the criminal penalties for date or spousal rape. So, as a result of that, more and more victims are finally reporting those acts of violence and receiving services that help them move away from crisis to stability. And I believe that more communities are providing those safe places for women to go to when they're have been victims of violence, and the criminal justice system has improved in our state as at least. I hope in most of yours, and so it's their ability to keep those victims safe and hold the perpetrators responsible for their actions is improving. Um, VAWA really created a positive change. But as we say in politics, there's almost always more work to be done.
Yeah, and it's also important to note when that work is working, because so many people. What we are concerned about, in thinking even about the election year that we are in, when people don't feel that voting works and that the folks that they are electing to go and do a job are actually making an impact, it has an extreme dampening effect. And it is important in conversations like these for us to lift up the kinds of important systemic and policy changes that you all are making that are actually helping people to do things differently in their lives, to protect them, to make their lives safer. So, in this election year, this is my final question. And maybe I can combine actually the last two that I wanted to ask, which is one, because on this sort of like idea around supporting people, what can states do to support women of color and help prevent violence? And two, how can voters help to ensure that their government is working to protect them?
So I think, as we mentioned, that these protections, extra protections with VAWA, are really important. But it's also important that we are helping and putting in place resources to help women and families that are victims of violence. States can implement violence prevention and intervention initiatives and try to break that cycle and curb that violence. Gun laws, can we create stricter gun laws, please, for those convicted crimes related to domestic violence? Um, Heighten the awareness. One of the things that I was also able to do last year was to create a specialty license plate for the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, to bring awareness when people drive around with that on their car and they ask, what is that? And get more information about it. And so we want to make sure that our constituents know how to get help. So as a woman, I know how to safely reach out to somebody. And when others reach out to me, I have those resources available. But you ask about how, we can be better represented. Just remember that everybody's vote counts. And everybody should be looking at their representatives, whether it's at their city level, their county level, their state level, their federal level, and ask yourself, are these people representing me in the best way possible? Is the candidate against abuse of powers, or is the candidate willing to abuse their powers? So, for example, when Senator Joe Biden wrote and championed the Violence Against Women Act, um, and Congress enacted it. And then he still stands with women today, having reauthorized that act in 2022. So it's so important that you really look at the people that are representing you, that are running to represent you, and do they have your best interest in mind? And vote. Get out and vote, and encourage everybody to vote.
Absolutely. As you can see, we are actually listening to folks who are making a real difference and a real impact on some really tough issues. So I'm going to move from here to calling in our topic around women as caregivers. And I would love to turn to Delegate Valderrama around this conversation. Women make up the majority of informal and unpaid caregivers in the US, but many are not prepared for the emotional, physical, and financial toll of taking on the care of a loved one. I mean, I sit in the sandwich generation and these folks are like crying out for help. For most women of color, they report having no choice but to become a caregiver on top of their job and parenthood duties. Because informal caregiving is not an official job or career, there aren't many formal supports in place to help women struggling to take care of others. There is concern that without enacting legislation to support caregivers now, there won't be support for those who sacrifice so much when it is their turn to need care. So I'm going to jump right into our first question. As America continues to age, informal or unpaid caregivers are increasingly in demand to take care of spouses, parents, adult children, and other extended family members and friends, and sometimes multiple people at once. Disproportionately caregiving defaults to women. According to a 2020 report from AARP and National Alliance for Caregiving, 61% of caregivers are women, many of whom also have full-time jobs and other responsibilities like raising children, volunteering, and doing housework and chores. While a majority of caregivers report being white, 61%, 17% are Hispanic or Latino, 14% are non Hispanic, African American, or Black, 5% Asian American and Pacific Islander, and 3% some other race, ethnicity, including multiracial. A separate study found that 80% of Native American caregivers are women. Though the expectation of caregiving is often cultural, many report feeling burdened by having no choice in taking on their caregiving role, with AARP reporting 61% of Asian American caregivers saying this more often than other racial groups at 55%. Delegate Valderrama, what is going on here? Why don't women have a choice but to become caregivers?
Well, I can't speak for all the women in our nation, but I can. Another factoid that I will share, which is part of the reason this is the topic at hand with me, is that I am a caregiver. So I mentioned my father briefly, who's my predecessor. He just turned 91 years old. God bless him, last month. And so it has, and I do not have my mother anymore. She is an angel up above. So in our culture, and it is very cultural. But when I talk to more people, not just legislators and my female colleagues, it's a family thing. I mean, it just, I don't want to say it fell upon me, but as the eldest of two, I took it upon myself. And so while I represent, as the chair of the National Asian Pacific American Caucus of state legislators, we know the burden is very real and it's for all women. And it's likely the expectation of inherent devotion. I'll say, I know I'm devoted to being my father's caregiver, and it's been embedded, I'd say, in most women, if not all women. And since we were little, right? So possibly for generations. And there's that good old adage saying that a daughter is a daughter all of your life, and a son is until he takes a wife. So I'd say, just like in parenthood, women are often the primary caregivers, and we're also the primary informal caregivers to those who need help. And so it's how society tells us that media shows us that it's woven into the very fabric of our lives, and especially in my culture. And so while I know at some point in this webinar, we're going to get to the wage gap soon, but there's so much to be said about the often silent and unpaid work for those who are caregiving for someone else that happens to fall on the shoulders of so many women. So I have here that ARP has done some research and put a number on it, and that number is in the thousands of dollars. So AARP's information, well, at least of 3 years ago, for caregiving out-of-pocket costs, report says 3/4 of caregivers, which is about 87%, 78%, I should say, report regular out-of-pocket costs related to caregiving. And they average it about 7.2, right? Thousand average spout. I'm here in legislative session as we speak. So it speaks to how it's not just the woman or the wife or the mother, but the family too, right? So in order for me to be here doing the job for our state and my respective colleagues here, our family also too caregivers, right? It's not just the women, but given we are the fierce Quad Caucus here with the female leaders,
Oh, we had your sound impacted, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I sorry about that. Hopefully I wasn't cut off too much. I'll just say that it isn't just us as women. We also have our families who are the caregivers in my particular case, given that I represent here in the legislative session. So you need your family to step in as well. So I don't want to take away from the women who believe, I know there's a sentiment out there, not for all, but that it's not very rewarding to be a caregiver. But I would say that I have met, may not be a ton, but there are women out there, and it's hard to find them, right? And not just women, but caregivers in general. So I don't want to take away from the sense that who believe it is rewarding work, because it is rewarding work. It is a lot of patience. I will say that, to be able to take care of loved ones, such as I try to do my best to do for my father. It's definitely not easy to take on. And for me, what makes caregiving even more challenging for women, especially women of color, are the added sacrifices and the adverse personal consequences that occur, that come along with caregiving, that further compound on top of other challenges, just because we are a minority, and especially those of minority families. So
Yeah, and look, I think my my husband is from the Netherlands, so when he moved here, his friends jokingly said, "You must be very healthy," um, because it's understood that, I mean, this is a system challenge. This is more than sort of the emotional and the familial and cultural undertaking that in other places people may take on, but may also have some help and have some other structural assistance. So the question is, as more folks are sort of aging in place, and as more adults over 50 would prefer to age in place, and it may even mean moving in with a family member or a friend. And as the US increasingly depends on informal caregivers to deliver essential support to older adults, what kind of supports exist for caregivers who take on all of this extra work? Is there are there some systems answers to this? What more can states do? I'm going to kind of combine because I know we're running down on our time.
well, let me see if I can condense that as well. So, like, as you mentioned briefly, so like the support in the complex care tasks that the nation's caregivers provide are largely, they haven't really changed in about almost a decade, right? So with today's caregivers providing about 24 hours, all day care each week, there can be, as we know, and I know from personal experience, there can be some very harmful effects on the caregivers, on their own health, on their own finances, and their own emotional well-being as well. So again, in a study that the AARP did, the info I have here on caregivers found that more, and I'm speaking as the chair of the Asian caucus, that more Asian caregivers find their role highly emotional and stressful. I know I can speak to that personally. Love my father. And then more so than, and again, this is just information provided, that either African American or the Hispanic caregivers. So according to their information, most Hispanic caregivers report a moderate to high level of physical strain due to caregiving, whereas African American caregivers less often report being in excellent or very good health than their white counterparts. Similarly, the Native American caregivers have reported that increased stress from caregiving, and many reported decreased potential personal health and financial strain. So, I mean, all of that to say is that we all share that that I don't want to say burden, because it's not a burden to care for a loved one, but the sacrifices that come along with it, right? And so, again, this is all on top of minority households that already, a lot of them, I'm not saying all of them, but a majority have lower household incomes and education, not as educated, we'll say, than their white counterparts. So, I mean, like Asians and like the Hispanic counterparts, caregivers, they leave bills unpaid, unfortunately, or pay them late. They're unable to afford basic expenses, food, move to a less expensive place to live. So I'll just say, in addition, many African American caregivers live with the person that they're caring for. In my case, that is how it is for me. And so, which is often an added stressor, right, to an already stressful situation. So, um, it just, the information is there. The research demonstrates that caregivers such as myself, spousal caregivers reporting associated strain, are nearly 2/3 more likely, unfortunately, to pass within 4 years than their non-caregivers. I mean, it's the real deal. And so for those who I don't, fortunately, don't have to have the stress of being a caregiver, that's a blessing. But I do find it a blessing. I just want to reiterate that I do find it a blessing that can also come with quite a bit of strain and stress. But I believe, after having been honored to participate in this webinar with my fellow Shiros, that we'll find the way to get that done nationally.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And
Thank
look, I
you.
think that for a lot of folks, even just knowing that this is an issue that you see it, you understand that it is a priority, you understand that this is something that we've got to put some real attention towards and some real policy solutions towards. I think it's really important. And a lot of voters actually have realistic expectations about time and change. They just need to hear that there is a focus on it. And so I am going to now move to our final topic. And this is one that is incredibly impactful to our communities as well, and that is the wage gap that you all started to reference. So we know that parenthood plays a major role in wage parity and education. Uh, the impact is upside down almost at this point. The wage gap disproportionately targets women of color and has long lasting negative effects on their lifetime, our lifetime career earnings, retirement, savings, pensions, and Social Security, thereby creating this unrelenting cycle of low income families. Though the gap is closing at a glacial pace, there are opportunities for states to enact pay transparency laws and other enforceable legislation, as well as opportunities for companies to offer accessible and affordable childcare, as well as creating management pipelines for women workers, both of which help to ensure all women can earn equal pay as men. I'm going to turn to Representative Romero to really help walk us through this conversation. Women have long been heralded as second class citizens, and various laws have been enacted, such as the Equal Pay Act in 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009, to legally pay men and women equally for jobs that require the same skills and responsibilities. But regardless of this progress, not much has changed from 2002, where women on average earned 80 cents for every dollar earned by men, to 2022 when they earned 82 cents. So there's more data that kind of goes into, and you all can see it, breaking this down among the different groups of women of color. But going directly to the question, while parenthood may impact women of all ethnicity and races, there are additional factors at play for women of color. Representative, why is narrowing the wage gap so difficult for women, and specifically for women of color?
And I think it goes back to all the discussions we've been having with the previous presenters, my fellow Quad members. It's that social fabric. If you look at the United States of America and you look at the histories of our community, whether it's segregation, slavery, whether it's genocide when it comes to our Native folks and putting people on reservations, or whether it's indentured servants, or you look at now people who have immigrated here, or you look at people who, even in Utah, from the Japanese community during a war, were put in internment camps. So you have to look at that social fabric, and you have to look at how racism has played a role within our country, and how people of color have been not treated the same. And so when we're looking at women, that's even, it makes it even more complex. And so for me, you can't talk about the pay gap without looking at history, and looking at the history of people of color, and how we've been treated. And so what's scaring me and what's really frustrating is we're looking at this national movement. We're pushing back on DEI. We're pushing back on things that are making things more equitable. And this has been a focus of many individuals for a long time. And so, in order to change those gaps, we have to look at those inequities. And many people don't want to look at that reality and see how they play a role in that. And this is something we've been trying to tackle here, even in Utah. My colleague, Senator Escamilla, had the funding for additional daycare services by using state facilities. But we had a colleague, and we have to, when we're talking about women, we have to remember who are the people who are advocating for women. Just because someone's a woman doesn't mean they don't advocate for women. Doesn't mean they advocate for women. So she had this bill, she had secured the funding so we could do a private partnership with the state to provide more daycare services for working women. And it was basically killed by another woman in the House, even though there was funding. And so I think we have to look at this. If we can't accomplish at a national level, what can we do in our states? But daycare, transportation, education, all of those play a role. And if people don't have access and they don't have those opportunities, how are they supposed to advance themselves and advance their communities and advance their families? And even when women of color have an education, they're still not getting paid at the same level as their white counterparts, even white women in most situations.
No, you're absolutely right. Once again, the connectedness of all of these issues is incredibly important. They do not, as Audre Lorde, we do not said we don't live one issue lives. I mean, and we just know that these are root cause pieces that are so connected. President Biden declared National Equal Pay Day on March 12th, stating that in more than 90% of occupations, women earn less than men, and these disparities are even greater for women of color and women with disabilities. Forbes Advisor says that there are only a few areas where women earn higher salaries than their male counterparts: compliance officers, vocational nurses, and wholesale and retail buyers. Why? Why is this?
Again, it's like shouting it out from the rooftops. How does the past, the present, and the future intertwine, and how does that impact women of color? I have a master's degree, and there's many women here in the body that have master's degree that are on my side of the aisle. And I'll use this as an example. I have a colleague who came up to myself and Representative Hollins. She's the only Black legislator here, and he said, "I didn't realize y'all had a master's degree." And I told him, "I didn't realize you had a high school education." And I hate to be that direct, but again, there's these stereotypes, and it's about opportunity and access. And that's why it's so scary what's happening across our country in certain states where we're taking away DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, at a municipal level, at a college level, within your local governments. But how does that impact the private sector? And we're starting to see the private sector not value that as well. So if we're being erased as communities of color, why should people value us, and why should people want to pay us what we deserve? And so that's where we, as the Quad Caucus, and are calling out on people across our country to get behind initiatives that support DEI. We can't say it enough. And to make sure that we're providing that access for everyone. And we know that this is all systemic. And until we change those systemic frameworks, we're going to continue to have this conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you for lifting up the fight back that you all are putting an emphasis on, because we are losing some of the important gains that took people years to get put into place, have been fought for year after year on various levels, statewide ballot initiatives, all kinds of ways in which these things have tried to get stripped away. So when women are making less money than men, and women of color make less money than white women, how does this impact other areas of life?
Impacts all the things we've just been talking about: access to healthcare, access to having someone help with children, access to mental health. I mean, that's something we haven't really, we touched on a little bit, but access to mental health, when you're carrying the world on your back, who do you go to? How do you make sure that you're taking care of yourself so that you can still be there to support your family and your community? And not being able to afford a home. If you look at the cost of living right now and we look at inflation and everything else, what's going to happen to these individuals? And what it provides is it makes people feel hopeless. And so that's why we as elected officials have to step up, and we have to advocate for our communities, and we have to, in states that can, be a little bit more transparent. But until we really, and transparency is good, but until we really close that gap, we're going to continue to see these struggles for many people in our community when it comes to access to mental health, access to transportation, access to healthcare, a quality education, and a roof over their head. Many of our families are close to experiencing homelessness, or they're working 4 or 5 jobs because they're not valued.
Um, yes, and I'm so to sort of like add to that then, because the Center for American Progress projected that is projecting that gender pay equity won't become a reality until 2056. Do you think that that is a realistic time frame to close the gap? You've just named some other major pieces that also contribute to the gap. So, what do you think? What do you see as the projection?
I'm hoping that that closes the gap. But again, I'm a little nervous about what I see happening across the country and states. So until we get it together at a congressional level and an executive level, and we mandate stuff to come from that place, I worry about what individual states will do to hinder progress for specific populations, because they feel like we're playing on a level playing field and we're not. And so those are my concerns. And so it's really important when people go to the ballot box, they look at who they're voting for and where they stand on these public policy issues and how that impacts their community. And people can't let these laws that are happening at a state level, because we are state elected officials, discourage them from getting involved in voting. It should motivate people to do it more and to identify who are their public policy makers. Do they really represent their voice? Do they care about all people in their community? Do they want to make sure they have an equitable society? And so the pay gap is huge, because we see in many of our families, women are the leaders of those families. Women are the main provider in those households. And we have to look back again on the history. How did the past and the present, and how will that impact our future on how our communities thrive and how our communities grow? And until we really legislate something and hold people accountable, and also hold some of our private corporations accountable to be paying people a fair wage. But in particular, when it comes to women, and this even deals with sexual assault, we just need to believe women. We need to support women. And we don't do that enough as a country.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been a really important conversation. And I know we've gone over our time a little bit. And I don't know if there was anything else before we close out that anybody wanted to add, but I wanted to certainly open that up for us to have final words.
Well, I just want to say thank you all for being here with us today. And if you've seen me distracted, I have these 2 little girls here with me today. And I just want to say that, in our Native tradition, we look to what's happening now, we look in the past, but we also look to the next 7 generations. And the work that we are all doing here now within our own states and our own communities is really important. But when we are unified and when we are making a really coordinated, concerted effort with women as leaders, those are the investments in the future, and for the next 7 generations as well. So thank you for moderating today, and thank you all of you who joined and those that put this together. It's really been an incredible afternoon.
And I just want to add, I feel honored to be on the panel with these 4 amazing women. And the legislation I do, I work on a lot of sexual violence and murdered and missing Indigenous women. I'm also Indigenous as well as Latina. And the good senator, I modeled a lot of my legislation after her. And so I think it's important to show that even though we've never met in person, she has inspired me and influenced the way I do my legislation. And all the women here, like, us united and bringing our caucuses together, we're just going to be that much stronger and ensure that our communities are protected and that our communities have a voice. So I appreciate all that they do in their home states, but also that they serve as role models to me and to other women. I think sometimes we're comfortable in these places, but we don't realize how much we inspire other women by just seeing us in these positions of power.
Absolutely. And I'll just chime in by saying thank you to all of you beautiful ladies inside and out. I know I haven't met all of you in person, but I'm looking forward to that, hopefully this interim. With that said, I know there was some question about how we came to be with these 4 issues, but I think we can all attest that these issues aren't new. They're they're ongoing and will continue to be. And unfortunately, that whole issue, Representative Romero, about the wage gap, there was a point in my tenure where I put in an equal pay, equal work bill, and the fact that the stats are saying 2056, I have to say, is grotesque. But having said that, just looking at all the women here, I'm actually quite psyched. I'm really excited. I was kind of hoping this would go longer, so it's my understanding, and I hope it's everyone else's, that this will continue, and this is like the first historic Shiro webinar, and that there will be more to come. I'm hoping anyway, and I'm happy to play a part, even if I'm not the chair anymore.
And I say ditto to all of the comments that have been made, and say I consider it an honor to be a part of these wonderful women that are leading their particular caucus. And I look forward to us getting back together, because I believe that maybe we can find a bill or a statute that we would like to have each one of us maybe introduced within our individual states, and see and watch it go through the process and share what we learn, or how we can be more effective as we work together. Thank you for the opportunity.
Mathoni, can I just add 1 cent for all of us? I noticed that each 4 of us legislators have a leadership role, and I think that really rocks. And I know there are some people out there, not just especially men, but men are men, but even our female counterparts who say, well, that's not a big deal, but it is a big deal to serve in leadership as women of color. So I just wanted to say that. I give props to all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, because power is a big deal. And when you are moving up in leadership, you are helping to set the agenda. You are helping to decide the priorities of your legislative sessions. You are truly also in a position to help do some of the best organizing around votes, around really critical issues. And so I am with you. I truly apologize again as well for not having gotten everybody's leadership titles correct, because I honor them. I really do. These are hard positions to get to. There's a lot of work that goes into moving up in your caucuses. These are competitive spaces with lots of people who want to lead ish, or they want your titles, but not doing the kind of really important work and representing the values that we are all so happy that you are helping to represent and push forward. That is the only way that you cut down from 2056. It is the only way that we are going to be able to solve some of these complex issues, is that we have fearless leaders who are ready to keep pushing us further and further, and to help stop the declines that we are seeing. And that's where they count on all of you who have joined us here today. You're caring. The fact that you would join a webinar like this in the middle of a Friday afternoon says a lot about you. And so, as the delegate said, there will be more of these to come. We thank you all so much. Take good care, and thank you to the fearless leaders.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Happy Easter.